In the years immediately following the Civil War, the railroad was king. And if the railroad was king, its prince was the conductor. The engineer might have gotten to sit up front, blow the whistle and drive the train, but he couldn't move that train 1 inch until the conductor told him. Joe Baldwin had always wanted to be a conductor. One day, he finally realized his lifelong dream when he was hired to be a conductor on the Wilmington and Manchester line. The W&M stretched from the coastal town of Wilmington, North Carolina, westward to Columbia, South Carolina, then down to Charleston, a town that Joe loved, never tired of visiting. The beautiful homes, the water, the huge helpings of fried chicken and sweet potato pie that his friends cooked for him. It made his mouth water just thinking about it. Joe would appear at work every morning, smartly turned out in his clean, pressed black pants, starched white shirt, black leather vest, and spurtly tied bow tie. On top of his head was the conductor's hat, with a medallion on the front that glistened like gold in the sunlight and read, "Conductor." He always carried his lantern with him, along with a ticket punch and, of course, his railroad watch. Multiple times a day, he would check from wheel to wheel, from end to end of the train just to make sure that everything was okay. He would make sure that the passengers had everything they needed, and that there was always enough oil for the lamps so they wouldn't burn out at night. One stormy night, Joe and his train was traveling through the swampy woods near Maco, North Carolina, which is a few miles west of Wilmington. Joe was on the back of his caboose resting. He had just completed his rounds, and he was taking a short break before they reached South Carolina. Dreams of Charleston danced in his head as the clickety-clack of the train lured him to sleep. Suddenly, the train started to slow down, and Joe instinctively woke up in a flash. Immediately, Joe got worried, for he knew it wasn't time for a stop yet. He jumped up, ran to the front of the caboose, and opened up the door where he was going to step out to the next coach. But there was no next coach. Joe was mortified to see that the rest of his train had abandoned him, and he was the only one on that caboose. Somehow, the train had uncoupled from the caboose, and he was all alone in the middle of nowhere. Through the distant darkness, he knew that the rest of his train was there. Joe also knew he was in trouble because he knew that there was another train coming up right behind him. He knew that a fast freight would be coming soon. Joe ran out onto the rear landing and peered through the rain and fog, desperately trying to spot the train. Before long, way off in the distance, he saw a pinpoint of a light, and he knew it was the freight train coming toward him. As the light got bigger, he could almost hear the wheels of the train chugging toward him, louder and louder. Joe ran out onto the rear landing of the train, and he began flailing his lantern left and right, trying to warn the freight train engineer. He knew that the engineer could not hear him, but he did it anyway. The train got closer and closer and closer. He then heard the sound of the brakes screeching, then the sound of the train going in reverse, and that was the last thing that Joe Baldwin ever saw. After the dust cleared, there was silence on the tracks. The steam was still hissing from the freight train, and only the light from Joe Baldwin's lantern was seen. It had been thrown into the deep, dark swamp and had continued to burn through the night. The next morning, people came to search the wreckage and finally found Joe's mangled body near the caboose. To their horror, they found that he was decapitated in the crash. However, an autopsy later revealed that it was a clean cut across Joe's spine and his head, meaning that his head did not explode in the crash. They did look for his head, but they never found it. A few weeks later, the station master at Maco stepped out onto the platform on another dark and foggy night. As he looked down the tracks, he saw what he thought was a pinpoint of a light coming toward him. He checked his watch, but there wasn't supposed to be any train arriving then. The light kept moving down the tracks, as if someone was carrying a lantern. Then it started to swing back and forth, slowly at first, but as it got closer to the station, it swung wilder and wilder and wilder. And then, It turned and went back down the tracks until it disappeared into the darkness. The station master didn't know what to make of it at first, and eventually dismissed it from his mind, but then the light started to come back more and more, mainly on nights when there was stormy weather. Again, it would start out as a tiny pinpoint, but then grew larger as it approached, swinging back and forth. Then, as it neared the station, it would go back into the woods. The station master wasn't the only one who saw the light, however. Engineers approaching Maco would see it along the tracks, and they would stop their trains, thinking it was a signal. They finally had to make a special rule at Maco where any signals to any train had to be done with 2 lights instead of 1. Folks began coming to Maco from all over to see what become of the Maco light. Scientists even tried to come up with a plausible theory, however they could never find out. Some folks say it was the ball of lightning, or swamp gas. In later years, it was believed that it was automobile headlights reflecting off the tracks, but all the locals knew what it was. They knew it was Joe Baldwin coming back to look for his head. In 1977, the railroad was shut down and the tracks were torn up. After the tracks left, so did the light, and it hasn't reappeared since. Whether Joe Baldwin found his head or some other measure of peace, that was the last anyone had ever saw of the Maco swinging light.